Hill et al. State that arts marketers work as cultural intermediaries, quote, acting as agents to constitute art and its meanings alongside other cultural participants, the artists, and the consumers, as well as the art product itself. The artist creates art and art experiences from their own sociocultural understandings, refined by their individual creativity and imagination. Cultural intermediaries then try to ascribe meaning to the products of the artist and art activity as they market them. Audiences or individual cultural consumers can choose to accept or reject the meanings mediated to them through the process of marketing, and will themselves appropriate artistic experiences to establish their own meanings as part of their shaping of their individual identity. End quote. Scholars such as Stuart Hall have advocated that we do not consume culture blindly, either literally or morally. Systems of power encode culture, but we consumers decode their political, economic, and social meanings. We also assign cultural intermediaries to influence our taste and consumption. Traditionally, these were figures from elite and specialized professions such as critics or style editors. Since the advent of what Henry Jenkins has called Web 2.0 or convergence culture, that field of cultural intermediary has diversified. The consumer is now not only the producer, but an influencer of taste. This means we can understand the role of the cultural intermediary as transcribing value and desire. This lecture looks at who is appointed as tastemakers and why this is relevant to arts marketing. I have looked for a visual metaphor to tell the story of tastemaking and consumption. I have chosen the character Hannibal Lecter from the TV series Hannibal, who is looking very skeptically at us from this slide. In this lecture, we can understand Hannibal as a visual metaphor for culture. Hannibal is our icon for exploring what we are using culture to produce. Pierre Bourdieu argues that taste has been considered as a marker for class in the global north. This means that if taste relates to culture, then culture has a relationship with economic power. Bourdieu argued that power is maintained and attained through forms of capital. One form is cultural, and he categorized cultural capital as being embodied, objectified, or institutionalized. One's accent or dialect is an example of embodied cultural capital, while a luxury car or an art collection are examples of cultural capital in its objectified state. In its institutionalized form, cultural capital refers to credentials and qualifications, such as degrees or titles, that symbolize cultural competence and authority. Cultural capital, then, is the collection of symbolic elements such as skills, tastes, posture, clothing, mannerisms, material belongings, credentials, etc., that one acquires through being part of a particular social class. Sharing similar forms of cultural capital with others, the same taste in movies, for example, or television, or having a degree from the same elite institution, creates a sense of collective identity and group position. This is what is behind the phrase, people like us. Certain forms of cultural capital are valued over others and can help or hinder one's social mobility just as much as income or wealth. Therefore, cultural capital can also be a source for social inequality. Think of what we associate as the taste of those who have high positions in our social order. We can think of how the objects attached to those tastes signal power and prestige. These symbols of status are symbols of power and often synonymous with what we read or what we think of as the good life. They also form a system which informs and instructs us in our judgment of taste or aesthetics. The Eurocentric view of this has largely evolved from Immanuel Kant's 1790 work, The Critique of Judgment, which we will discuss in more depth shortly. Here, I want to draw your attention to the value that is embedded in the phrase, the good life. If we are saying, this is a life that is good, it must also mean that we think that there is a life that is objectively, or at least aesthetically, bad. I would argue that the actual TV show Hannibal plays with, or queers, the morality of this in a very interesting way. But that is a lecture for another subject. What I want to discuss, or more specifically address, in this lecture is that in the field of practice, that is marketing, we often exploit this idea of the good life. We also have a tendency to entrench it in marketing because of the way marketing is intrinsically and explicitly tied to the function of consumerism. Within the practice of marketing, we are often advocating the position that the accumulation of luxury items or the consumption of culture is what makes the good life good. Bell Hooks argues that this is also a position that is adopted and reinforced by mass media, which often projects the message that, quote, all one's worth is determined by material things, end quote. It is not just the materialism or the lifestyle that we sell as the good life, but it is the refinement of taste and knowledge. We often sell the idea that consuming culture refines your palate. Refining your palate gives you the distinction of good taste, and good taste allows you to accumulate cultural capital. We should recall here Bourdieu's argument that cultural capital is tied closely to economic power. This means that those in elite positions are not just courting the culture that Bourdieu identifies with high art. Bourdieu is arguing that high art itself produces the elite. We can see the way art, those that make art, and those who consume art are represented in popular culture as often still tied to these tropes, specifically the tropes of taste set out by Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant argued that forms of cultural production delivered a moral pedagogy that manifested in taste that would instruct, reason, and cultivate perfection through social refinement. Kant's aesthetic broadly categorized cultural production into the agreeable, the beautiful, the sublime, and the good. This aesthetic system forms the core framework through which disciplines like art history judged works of art until largely the 20th century in the West. This means that Kant's idea of taste is the basis for a lot of the canon in art in the global North. This idea of aesthetics also became hitched to ideas of progress, specifically linear progress, with the West being the pinnacle of refinement or achievement. There is an implication here that scholars like Frantz Fanon critique, stating that this system of judgment reinforced ideas that anchored class and colonialism. There has been a huge body of work produced about institutional critique and unpacking or decentering these practices. What I'd like to do briefly is tie this idea of the hierarchy of class to other social, political, and economic hierarchies. Judy Davis, in her article, Selling Whiteness, applies many of these ideas to marketing directly through the lens of critical race studies. Davis states, quote, as social constructs, race and racism are significant topics concerning many practices and institutional cultures in society, including marketing activities and marketing organizations. She states that the legacies of colonialism, European control, and, quote, race-based distinctions among groups of people continue to impact the global socioeconomic landscape. One way in which this is reinforced by mass media and marketing is through the idea of whiteness, by which, quote, white culture represents the normal default position or marker against which all other cultures and perspectives are viewed, end quote. This loops us back to both Fanon and Bourdieu in the way the idea of whiteness intersects with class, as well as gender in systems of capital and power. This is manifest both in the production of culture, but also its distribution and circulation through consumption. However, we are not sheep. As Stuart Hall has pointed out through his work in representation and cultural studies, we are not passive in the transmission of these signs and symbols. We are not merely receptacles in this process of culture and taste. We have the agency and the capacity to resist as much as assimilate. As a marketer, in this particular historical moment, you are in a unique position to use culture to resist and to challenge. One reason for this is that the traditional cultural intermediaries' dominance over tastemaking has been displaced by contemporary marketing communication practices. We have always had word of mouth, but we have not always had Instagram. Although we can, and we should, question how this might be compromised by systemic and structural inequalities such as access to infrastructure, the rise of social networking sites has changed the channel of influence. One of the most significant drivers for this change in taste-making is technology. Another significant factor has been liberation movements,
Global South, and communities of color,
and LGBTQ+ communities, as well as counterculture social movements. These have produced a shift in our consciousness, if not our conscience. The cultural intermediary that dominated the influence of cultural taste has traditionally been the critic and the curator. Their accumulated cultural capital positions them to validate certain forms of culture and therefore invalidate others. They attribute worth, but also provide a channel for exposure to those who produce culture. The means of distribution until very recently were centralized, but with technology, the means of distribution have been significantly decentralized. Some might go so far as to say that this has democratized both the production of culture and its consumption. Technology, like social networking sites, have certainly diversified the means of distribution and popularized the consumer as producer. Although this has dramatically changed both marketing and consumption practices, we need to think critically about what this means and what this has meant in terms of power and control. What ties the former tastemaking to more contemporary manifestations is that the consumption of the arts is linked to the way we perform our identities. We attribute and produce not just meaning by consumption, but also knowledge and disruption. In this way, we might say that consuming the arts has been and still is about transformation. It is the nature of that transformation and our active relationship in defining it on our own terms that may have shifted. What changed? I think it is linked to the set of cultural competencies and behaviors attached to the economies of neoliberalism. In other words, changes to our economic systems change both our needs and our desires in consuming culture. It doesn't change the fact that cultural capital has meaning through political, social, and economic mobility. It can change what that meaning means. So then, what do we want culture to give us to consume today? The practices of marketing in the experience economy are oriented towards individualism and interaction. We could therefore generalize that contemporary consumption is linked to the knowledge and experience economies. This means we have an embedded and embodied desire for emotion, immersion, and participation. Gretchen Larson argues that consuming the arts today is, quote, primarily subjective and influenced by fantasy, feelings, and fun, thus highlighting the primacy of emotions, experience, and the subconscious over rationality. This could be contradicted by the desire for an emergence of cultures of empathy. I think there is strong evidence to suggest we seek a collective as much as a space for our own singularity. Perhaps in the balance, what we are demanding is for culture to change more than for it to stay the same. Culture itself is perhaps done politely knocking on the door. This requires of us, particularly those of us working in a marketing capacity, to ask what culture we are endorsing and promoting, and to whom are we accountable for endorsing and promoting it. In other words, we are going to ask what or who is the culture breaking down our door. We will ask, what is culture asking of us? And what do we need to ask of culture?